the Jobava London. It is a very tricky opening, a very aggressive opening that seems to be gaining in popularity. It's easy to lose too quickly if you don't know what you're doing. In this video, I am going to show you the easiest way to deal with it. So let's get into it. This is the starting position. We've got the bishop on f4, that's the London part, and what makes it the Jobava is knight c3. So there's a few different move orders to talk about here. We could get here after d4, d5, knight c3, knight f6, bishop f4, or you could also play knight f6 first, and if your opponent is going for the Jobava, they'll play knight c3, and here after d5, bishop f4, we would get to the same position. Whether you play knight f6 or d5 on move 1 should be based on the rest of your d4 repertoire for black. For example, if you play the Queen's Gambit Declined or the Slav, you need to play d5. Or if you play something like the King's Indian Defense or the Nimzo Indian, you would play knight f6. For the purposes of the Jobava, it's not really going to matter. We're going to transpose anyway. I would recommend playing d5 here, even if you're not a player who plays d5 on move 1, because white is kind of threatening to play e4. And if you do something like g6, e4, yeah, you can do this, but giving your opponent the center so easily is quite risky. So to me, the most logical move is d5. All right, bishop f4. So let's get into it. This is really the starting position. And of course, there's many ways you can play, but I'm going to show you what I think is by far the easiest way. I played the Jobava with white myself, and I kind of came to this line because honestly, I have no idea what to do with white to even cause any problems. So the first move is e6. So this is a really solid move. We're setting up this central pawn chain, very solid central structure, and getting ready to develop our bishop and castle kingside. So very much in line with standard opening principles. If given the chance, we will pin this knight. That's one downside of the early knight c3. And that can be an annoying pin for white if they allow it. The only downside of this move is we are blocking in our light squared bishop. But we are going to get that bishop into the game later, and I'll show you how we do that. But e6, we're planning bishop b4. So white has two main alternatives here. One is e3, just continuing development. And then the other is they can also play knight b5 and immediately threaten c7. So we'll look at both of these. Let's start with e3. Now, our idea with e6 was bishop b4, so we should play this now. And we've got this pin, and we can even start increasing the pressure with knight e4 if we want to. So white's most common move here is bishop d3. It does appear that something like knight f3 would be an inaccuracy, because here we could already play knight e4, and it's actually pretty difficult for white to deal with that pressure on c3. So they usually do play bishop d3, and here we go c5. So immediately contesting the center, ready to perhaps play c4 and push this bishop back. We're ready to play, we also open up a line for our queen to increase the pressure here. So white usually takes on c5. And I mean, they could even go wrong very badly here. Knight e2, c4, we would just win the bishop. So that would be more or less game over. So d takes c5. And here the move, this is a slightly tricky move, but one that's worth remembering. We don't want to take with the bishop on c5 just yet, because our bishop's doing a good job pinning this knight. And we might want to take here and give white doubled isolated pawns. So the best move here, or at least the move I like, knight d7, getting a knight out, preparing to take with the knight on c5, which would also look at this bishop. Maybe we could grab the bishop pair, or also advance this pawn. So a useful move in a lot of ways. Now, how we're going to, so we can capture on c5 with either piece. And how we're going to do that is going to depend on how white develops this knight right here. If they go knight e2, now they've defended c3. So our bishop with this pin is not really so useful anymore. So here, I would recommend just take with the bishop, and our idea is going to be at the right moment to play e5 and take over the center. And even watch out for this. This bishop is a little short of squares, so sometimes you can even play a6 and trap that bishop. But basically, we want to castle. We want to play e5. We have 2 center pawns versus white's 1. White's development's like a little bit weird with these pieces sort of tripping over each other. We just have good control of the center. We've got a little more space. No weaknesses in our position. So if anything, black already stands a little bit better. There's also knight f3. And here, we can actually take the other way, because now we do probably want to play bishop takes c3 at some point. So we can take with the knight and consider taking here next move and also castle. White is going to have doubled isolated pawns, and we even have a nice c file to pressure those. So make sure you understand why you go for the different captures depending on where this knight goes. Anytime you're learning the opening, the most important thing is to focus on the reason behind each move. But okay, so that is, by the way, I'm keeping this short. Obviously, with any opening, you can go as deep as you want, but I want to give you the basic idea. And if you understand it at this level, quite honestly, you are already ahead of most players. It's really more about understanding why you're doing what you're doing than memorizing endless lines. Okay, let's look at knight b5. Now, as we saw in the previous lines, this pin with bishop b4, if white allows it, is pretty annoying. So knight b5 is a logical move for that reason, not allowing us to pin the knight and creating a threat on c7. And the move I would recommend is knight a6, just defending this and developing a knight. Now, obviously our knight on a6 on the rim is not ideally placed, but white's knight on b5 is also misplaced, because once we answer this threat of c7, the knight's not doing anything there, and it's going to be chased away sooner or later. And by the way, one of the big things to understand conceptually about the Jobava is basically the knight on c3 is not really well placed either, because it's blocking white's c-pawn, which in a queen's pawn opening, advancing that c-pawn is one of the main ways you would contest for the center. So essentially, if you steer clear of all white's tricks and they just have that knight on c3, often they have a somewhat awkward position. So that's how I would think about playing black versus the Jobava. At any rate, knight a6, we defend c7, e3, and here is where we should exercise some patience and just chill, and we're just going to go bishop e7 and castle. We don't need to worry about this knight here, because with c7 defended, there's nothing else it can do. We are going to chase that away eventually, but there's no need to do it immediately. So let's just castle, finish development. So bishop e7, usually they play knight f3, castles. And okay, we've castled, our position's very solid, and our plan next is to play c6 first, chasing the knight back to c3. Remember, that's not a great square. And then c5, contesting the center. So that's what we're going to do against most white replies. And here, there are a lot of tries for white. I don't think any of them really cause black any problems, but let me just show you a few. And this is not, don't feel that you need to memorize all of these. I just want to show you some of the ideas. So according to the database on Lichess, bishop d3 is the most common. I don't think this is actually a great move here, because this bishop is going to get hit potentially by our c-pawn or our knight. But it's a typical London move, so a lot of your opponents will play it. So here we can absolutely go for our standard plan, c6, c5. And we throw in c6 to force white's knight back to c3. So now, if white just castles, we could certainly think about playing c4 and then maybe even set up a pawn avalanche on the queen side. Another very typical idea in this line is, well, this knight at a6 is not well placed, so usually you want to get it back to c6. And you can go either knight b4 or knight b8. So that's another maneuver you can do. Now, one thing a lot of players might be worried about is bishop takes a6, giving us doubled isolated pawns. But this is actually completely fine for us, because we also get the bishop pair and this b file to work with. So if castles, a good idea to be aware of for black here is knight h5, going after the other bishop. And once we knock that out, we will be able to use the b file. So the most common move that white has played is bishop e5, but we can still chase the bishop down. f6, takes, rook b8. And despite doubled pawns, black's doing really well here. We've got 2 bishops versus 2 knights. We have the open b file. We've got a nice pawn center. You could even think about maneuvering this light squared bishop over here to find an active post. But for the moment, there's just some annoying pressure on this pawn. What else can white try? Well, there's, rather than bishop d3, they could also play bishop e2. We could go for the same plan. And here, just developing the bishop with bishop d7 is a fine way to go. And after that, we are looking to bring the knight back over to c6. Black, really solid position, no weaknesses, absolutely fine. Show you just one more option for white that is maybe slightly different. Knight e5, also a logical move. And here I would change the plan slightly and actually just go c5 in one move. And the reason for that is if we do this here, this bishop takes a6 idea does have a bit more venom because white can come in with knight c6, which is a bit annoying. So we can just play c5 directly. And again, go for this typical idea, knight b8, knight c6 next. And ultimately a similar position where black is fine. So, of course, there's a lot more we could talk about, but I think that's a great outline. And honestly, if you really know and understand just what I've covered in this short video, you're in great shape to get a very good middle game against the Jobava London. And if you really want to memorize or remember your opening lines, I will tell you a great drill you can do. Open up an empty Lichess study or chess.com library or chess base file. They're all basically the same thing, whichever you're comfortable with, whichever you use, and enter in as much of the lines from this video as you can remember purely by memory. So don't check the video, don't check the database, the engine, anything, just your memory, enter in the lines. This is the best drill I know to ensure that you remember your opening lines. And anywhere where you're confused or you can't remember, just make a note and you can come back to the video and fill it in later. Or I'm also linking a Lichess study for reference that you can check. But you might think as a shortcut just to use my study. It's not. Actually creating it for yourself is the most valuable step. And you might have noticed that I am not using any notes. I started with an empty study in this video. So I'm actually doing the drill right now. And that's not just to show off or whatever. That is because I'm doing the drill so that when I use these lines and my opponent uses them in the game, I will actually remember. And so will you if you do the drill.